Palm Sunday and the year is 1461. In this remote field in Yorkshire, two massive armies are facing each other, preparing to go into battle. The weather's freezing and the snow begins to fall, and men at both sides are praying to their God for victory and for deliverance. But they both know that no quarter will be asked nor given. Suddenly the sky becomes dark with deadly arrows. Soldiers scream as they're hit, but this is only the beginning. Soon men are in pitched battle, hacking at each other with their swords and axes. Skulls are crushed, limbs are severed, and the snow runs red with blood. The Battle of Towton is in full cry. It's almost impossible for us to imagine the hell of medieval pitched battles, the bloodlust, the noise, the sheer brutality of the fighting. They were tests of strength, endurance, and of course raw courage. It was quite literally kill or be killed. Over the next hour, we'll get to see why weapons such as the poleaxe and the longbow were so deadly in the hands of medieval men-at-arms.
That is going to hurt.
We'll also see the effects they had on the human body and how the wounds they inflicted were treated. We'll find out how the weapons were made and what men did to try and protect themselves. And we'll try to get into the hearts and minds of the men that fought here at Towton more than 500 years ago. I'm Carl Uda Martinez. From an early age, I was thrown into the exciting world of jousting and historical combat stunt displays. I've always been fascinated with what it was like for the common soldier throughout history. What did they experience? What horrors did they witness? And how devastating were their weapons? On the battlefield, how important were these instruments of death? No one really knows exactly how many men fought at the Battle of Towton, but 50,000 would be a fair estimate. It was just one battle in what history remembers as the Wars of the Roses, the long struggle for power between the houses of York and Lancaster, the White Rose and the Red Rose. The Lancastrian army represented the official king, Henry VI, and was led by his noble advisor, the Duke of Somerset. The Yorkist army was led by Edward, son of the recently killed Duke of York, who was a rival for the throne and had the backing of the people of the south of England.
There was long-term and short-term causes to the Wars of the Roses, and it's important to understand those, to understand what happened at Towton. The first thing that we need to look at is the fact that the English monarchy was quite unstable at the time. In effect, the king was more represented as a figurehead, and the nobles were more powerful than the king. The other side of the coin is that the nobles had retinues of men that they could call upon to come and aid them in any conflict that they would pursue. And this war had become more of a dynastic thing now. There was two kings on the throne. Edward hadn't been actually crowned king, but he had been acclaimed king. So I think what Edward wanted to do was to seal his authority on the kingdom.
With England now in the problematic position of having two kings, Edward raced northwards to confront Henry VI's supporters and end any claim the Lancastrians had to the throne. The two sides found each other near the village of Towton in North Yorkshire on the 28th of March, 1460. The first taste of the violence that was to follow was a confrontation between the leading elements of the Yorkist vanguard as they crossed the River Aire and a force of 500 men led by the Lancastrian Baron John Clifford at Ferrybridge. After a gruelling fight, Clifford's men were beaten by the advancing Yorkists. By this time, the wars had taken on a bitter edge, and all of Clifford's force, including himself, were slaughtered as they tried to retreat. First blood, then, to the Yorkists. With the rest of the Lancastrian army camped 4 miles away at Tadcaster, the Yorkists paused near the village of Saxton and prepared for the coming confrontation. On the morning of the battle, the Yorkist army would have awoken from a bitterly cold night's sleep here at their camp just outside Saxton. As they looked across the valley, they would have seen the vast numbers of the Lancastrian army that they were about to face later that day. The Lancastrians certainly outnumbered the Yorkists. Amazingly, almost half of the English nobility turned out to fight. Most of them were Lancastrians. They also held the better position on high ground, with a river known as the Cock Beck on the right flank. The Yorkist army was going to have to attack uphill, a pretty daunting prospect.
On the Lancastrian side, the Duke of Somerset had recruited quite a large nobility into his army. The main thing with Somerset was that the Duke of York had killed his father, and people like Clifford, for instance, Lord Clifford of Skipton, was out for revenge. In the Yorkist army, Edward was quite an able soldier. He'd won a number of battles before Towton, but also he had advisors like Lord Falkenberg, for instance, who was 60 years old when he came to the Towton campaign. To a certain extent, the Lancastrians suffered in the amount of nobles that were in their army. The Yorkists didn't have so many with regard to communication, and this may have caused a problem within the Lancastrian army and its commanders at the time.
While the Wars of the Roses were very much an infight between the English nobility, it was still the common soldier who swelled the ranks and spilt blood for their masters' causes. What made the two sides all the more deadly was the fact that there were many archers amongst the masses, and they used the famous English longbow. It was medieval warfare's deadliest weapon, the machine gun of the day. It was a masterpiece of precision manufacture. It needed great skill, a lot of training, and enormous strength to be an effective archer. But why was the longbow such a formidable weapon? Well, I've travelled to the heart of Wiltshire to meet expert bowyer Richard Head to find out more. Richard, I'm so impressed with this as a weapon, but tell me a little bit more about it. Where does the longbow originate from?
The name longbow comes about by the bow being held long ways as opposed to a crossbow, which is crossways. But most people associate the longbow, and it is fairly long, at least 6 foot, 6'6" in the Middle Ages. Most people associate the bow with Robin Hood and the famous battles during the Middle Ages, Battle of Agincourt.
Now, what kind of wood is the longbow made out of? Is there a particular one that makes it the best, makes it the strongest?
The best wood was yew, cut from the yew tree. They did use ash, but it was not a very good wood for bows. It didn't have that spring that the yew has. If you look at the bow, you'll see on the back of the bow the very pale coloured sapwood, and that's good at resisting tension forces. So that forms the outside curve of the bow. The inside, which is this dark coloured heartwood, is very good at resisting compression. So that forms the inside curve. So you've got a natural laminate in this one wood, and with its natural springiness it produced a very good bow, because a bow after all is just a spring. It's drawn, it's bent, and it has to get back to its original position to shoot the arrow very, very fast.
For the men facing off against each other, the pause before the start of the battle must have seemed like an eternity. The weather had not improved. A bitterly cold wind whipped up a snowstorm which drove into the Lancastrian lines, blinding them. The seasoned Yorkist leader, Lord Falkenberg, understood how to use the weather to his advantage, and the discomfort experienced by the Lancastrians was his cue. Lord Falkenberg brought up his vanguard of archers to begin the battle. They used the mighty longbow, a weapon that devastated the French army throughout the medieval period, but was now to be used to kill fellow Englishmen on English soil. And so began the largest archery duel in British history.
The Battle of Towton was very unique because of the fact that it was snowing throughout the battle. We're told by the chroniclers that there was a following wind as well in reference to the archery duel. Then Falkenberg took advantage of this, and he marched his archers forward. he asked them to ply their trade into the Lancastrian ranks. When the Lancastrians replied, they were against the wind, it was bad visibility, and their arrows fell 60 yards short of the Yorkist lines, and all the Yorkists had to do was go forward, pick the arrows up and fire them back, and this continued for some minutes, where literally tons of arrows were falling on the Lancastrian troops.
So despite being on the higher ground, the Lancastrians were being hit by an almost constant shower of arrows. I asked historic military expert Kevin Hicks to explain why an arrow storm was so deadly. Kev, I'm a Lancastrian. I'm on the top of the hill, snowstorm, hail in my eyes, freezing cold, can't really see much down to the bottom of the Yorkist, and then suddenly a hailstorm of arrows, a barrage come thudding into our line. What's going on? What kind of devastation is happening on the battlefield?
Well, first of all, it's shock, isn't it? They couldn't see the arrows coming because of the storm. But if you look back to 1403, the Battle of Shrewsbury, there were witnesses there who watched an arrow storm. They said it went dark, but when the arrows hit the enemy, the men fell so quick, just like withering machine gun fire, I suppose, that it was like apples falling in an orchard in a storm in October. You just simply couldn't count them. They fell so quick. Devastating shock.
How many arrows are coming at you? What are we talking? A couple of hundred archers? A couple of thousand? What are we talking?
You're talking in the numbers of thousands to make it effective. If you take Towton Moor, you had ammunition, just like a machine gun today. It's ammunition. You don't have specialist bullets in a machine gun. You don't have specialist arrows in a major battle. You feed the most simple, the most cost-effective arrows. This is a short bodkin, an exact type of arrowhead from the Wars of the Roses. Very neat, very cheap to make. Steel, which is a surprising thing. And these, made by the tens of thousands, if not the millions throughout the land. A variation, you can have a slightly longer bodkin, but they are purely and simply ammunition.
Right.
Nice and cheap, plentiful, and simple.
Well, serious pieces of kit. Should we go and try them out, Kev?
Yeah, let's go and shoot something, shall we?
Definitely. Well, we've got one unlucky volunteer that's going to help us out test these weapons. Come on, Kev, let's string him up. He's heavy.
Yeah, you got the heavy end, mate.
I reckon he's suited and booted.
He'll do.
Come on, let's do it. So, Kev, explain to me what we're about to do.
Right, we've trussed up our volunteer, 3 layers, padding, chainmail, and the armour. I've got a stack of bodkins here, plus some bladed arrows, the broadheads. I've never shot at least 2 of these broadheads before. I want to see how they fly. And we'll see what damage we can do to the volunteer.
The volunteer. Let's do it. Kev, that looked pretty impressive. Let's go and see the damage that you've done.
You see if he's dead.
Yeah. All right, Kev, let's have a look at the damage. Oof, how fast are these arrows coming?
Over 100 mile an hour, 120, 125 mile an hour they've been timed.
You've got ones down here in the chainmail. That's gone straight through the chainmail.
Let's see what we've got. Now you can just see the shoulder of the, I think this is a bodkin, so that's gone all the way in. So if that's inside you, it's going to be hurting, isn't it? All right?
You're bleeding, big time.
You're bleeding, it's uncomfortable, you're in agony now. Right, you see this, it's blown a hole actually into the mail, hasn't it? And you see it's got a
look, it's
piece of mail actually on it, and that's gone all the way in there. So with all the filth and dirt, that's going to carry into the body.
That's going to go into the wound, going to make it even more infected.
Now this one here, if you look at the hole it's made, it's a lot smaller. So I've got a feeling this is actually a broadhead and it should be difficult to get out. Right, so let's have a little look. But if you look as I pull him back.
Yeah, that's the broad.
Yeah, it's just under the surface. The chainmail has slowed it down enough, hasn't it?
Ooh. Oh.
So that's how far that's gone in.
Wow, that is going to hurt.
Now look at that for a wound. Yeah, so the mail, no protection at all. The armour, we've put lots of holes in it. Padding here, we've gone straight through. Gosh. Yeah. And just flesh against the arrow, it speaks for itself, doesn't it?
Yeah, oh, look how far this has gone through.
Yeah.
And that's gone right through to the other side. There was also another weapon that could be used in the early stages of the battle. If a medieval arrow storm was not enough for the two sides to endure, recent archaeological evidence points to Towton being a turning point in the evolution of arms in Britain. In 2010, a metal detector unearthed two fragments of a handgun, a small medieval cannon. These early firearms had originated in China in the 1200s. What the find pointed to was that by Palm Sunday 1461, they were also being used in England, one of the earliest English gun use on record. I met up with military conservation expert Ian Henn to find out more about this medieval terror weapon. I've started to call this the Beast, Ian, because it just looks like a beast to fire and a bit of a serious piece of kit. So run me through what we're going to do with it.
It is, yes. I mean, it was these hand cannons were very short-range weapons, and they were loaded with all sorts of rubbish. They were loaded with shot or nails or scrap or gravel, whatever they could get hold of. They're very short-range. They were a terror weapon. People weren't used to seeing a big flash. They were used to mechanical weapons, right, crossbows, this sort of thing. Yeah. And this was really quite scary if they hadn't encountered it before. So we've simulated what we've got a sort of a target here that you're going to shoot at this kind of range. Is this the kind of range you want me to? This is the sort of range that you were looking at if you were defending a fortification and somebody was coming over the wall.
Okay, so brilliant. I'll hand him to you then.
Okay,
great. Here we go. Good luck.
You see, we have actually clipped it, but with the recoil, I didn't manage to keep it down low enough.
It just came up.
It did. I mean, that's the reason why it has this hook on.
Yeah.
Actually, so on the battlements, you would better hook over a wall,
right, or
something like that, just to take some of the shock off.
Yeah.
And then you could have a better chance of aiming it with the tiller on it.
We've caught some of it, but I can see why. Literally, it was more of a terror weapon, and you can imagine them all lined up. But it's not that accurate, though, is it?
No, it's not. No, but it didn't really need to be. It was firing at a row of attackers on a fortification. It didn't really matter which one you hit. It was going to be pretty scary.
And the noise.
Yes. Yeah.
Boom.
Yeah. And in low light conditions, you have quite a big flame coming out as well. So if you weren't used to gunpowder weapons, it would have been pretty terrifying.
Back here at Towton, under the constant hail of their own arrows, the Lancastrian army could not take this punishment any longer. Somerset ordered his men to attack the Yorkist line. The Lancastrian men-at-arms now advanced through the arrow-ridden corpses and wounded of what was left of their front line. The Yorkist archers, their task of dislodging their enemy complete, fell back through their own lines as their plate-clad comrades advanced to meet the Lancastrian attack. And now the two walls of men collided in a din of clashing steel and chilling yells. The slaughter of hand-to-hand combat had begun.
The Lancastrians suffered quite grimly. The casualties were mounting. The Duke of Somerset had no alternative but to start marching forward and come to grips with the enemy. So the second phase of the battle included hand-to-hand combat on the ridge, the highest most point of the battlefield. And this will have been pretty grim, brutal. There was no mercy, there was no quarter given. Edicts before the battle said that if you show any mercy, Edward said any mercy shown would be rewarded by death. And we can expect the battlefield to be quite slushy at that time, with snow, slipping, sliding, lots of people confused. the crush of the battle, the blood, and the fact that men were dying in heaps. This continued for probably a few hours, we're told.
By this time in the evolution of warfare, the cumbersome shield had been superseded by the need for more flexible protection. For the nobility and professional soldiers who provided the cutting edge of a medieval army, they looked to layers of expensive high-quality plate armour as protection against sidearms such as the mace and sword.
The arm was very flexible. There's all sorts of documentary evidence to point towards this. Certainly there's an illuminated manuscript where a man in armour is doing a cartwheel in a full suit of armour. Probably no more than 60 pounds in weight, so that is probably equivalent to a modern soldier's pack. But remember, this was distributed all over the body in the 15th century, so it was being distributed rather than on the back. It was quite easy to wear rather than quite difficult to carry about.
The men-at-arms at both sides hacked desperately at each other. In this bloody business of hand-to-hand combat, one weapon ruled supreme. That was the mighty poleaxe. The poleaxe was as grim a piece of medieval battle kit as was ever invented. The weapon of choice for many medieval men-at-arms, it was a lethal combination of blade, spike, and bone-crushing hammer.
It was very difficult to puncture armour, but there were specific weapons that were used and formulated to do that, like the poleaxe and the warhammer, which would puncture the armour and be used as like a medieval can opener to try and get to the flesh underneath.
Kevin, this is a deadly weapon. The sharp edges, the point, the hammer. Tell me a bit more about this poleaxe.
Well, it had such effect. It's actually in English, isn't it? Being poleaxed, being whacked round the head with one of these. It's a hammer. It is an axe. It has the razor-sharp spike, plus the two spikes here on the shoulders. Close quarters, it is the weapon. The man-at-arms would be trained how to use this. He would have had experience. He would know the weak points in the armour. He wears armour himself, yeah? And he would jam this through the visor slit, rake it between the legs, hook behind the knee, tearing the knee away. This is more of an instrument of death than just a blunt weapon.
Yeah, definitely a deadly weapon. Well, we've talked about the poleaxe, Kev. I mean, it is a serious, horrible looking weapon, but what kind of technique was used? Because you've got four different things going on here. You know, how do they use it? How do they fight with it?
Stand aside. Just a simple whack from the side. Yeah. Now, that would have hurt.
Yeah, just a little bit.
I think we've dented him just with the side spike.
That would have cracked his ribs completely, wouldn't he? Stomach crushed.
Hitting him with an axe,
Okay.
you know, you're bringing it down to here, but it's not just that. He might have full armour on there. Yeah. So you bring it down. Oh, actually I've gone right into the shoulder there.
Yeah, you have.
Yeah, but now I'm not going to stand there going, oh, I've gone right into the shoulder. I'm going to rip it out, right?
Whoa.
Bring the bloke down.
Yeah.
All right, and you can see that he's hooked
That's way in
right
there.
inside, isn't it?
So he could be a guy on the floor, a soldier on the floor, or even a cavalryman. You could be reaching up high and pulling him off his horse.
Hook him off, or even worse, the horse itself.
Yeah, brutal, brutal. In the horse.
Yeah.
Bring the horse down, then you cause carnage, chaos on the battlefield.
The whole business.
Stop the troops advancing because there's massive horses everywhere. Yeah.
Horse kicking, you know, horrendous, isn't it?
What else we got?
Well, you got the hammer.
Oh. Woo-hoo-hoo. Wow. Now, that hasn't actually sort of made a hole in the plate armour, but that is seriously going to damage him, isn't it?
Well, it crushed his ribs, burst his stomach. All the internal organs there ruptured. He'll be on his knees, won't he?
Yeah.
And the second you drop, you're finished. Because people don't go around you in a battle, yeah? Or you simply turn this on tail and finish the beggar. If you hit the armour, really, it's bad luck because you want to go from another piece, don't you?
Yeah, you're going to go for his leg.
Yeah, I mean, if you just have a quick look at the leg and that chain mail, say about here, yeah?
Yeah.
Now there's meat behind there and bone, yeah, there's padding, there is the chain mail, but if you just watch a very simple thrust, yeah? Right, we broke one link, let's give it a good old, yeah? We're going through each time.
Yeah.
Yeah, opening up the links.
You've gone right through the jerkin, padded jacket as well.
Yeah, down into the leg.
Oh,
Yeah, it's all going to hurt, isn't it? Yeah, oh, that's quite nice, actually. It does the job, eh?
It's a formidable weapon, isn't it? It's a hybrid weapon.
It's a real killer.
Yeah, you got your axe, you've got your spike, you've got your hammer. You can see why it was the weapon of choice in the battlefield and the destruction that it caused.
Oh yeah. Shall we just leave it there?
Back at Towton, the poleaxe was just one of many weapons used in the brutal close-quarter hacking that characterised medieval combat. Most men met their death at a distance of less than 3 feet, the length of a handsword. As the snow-covered ground became stained with blood, bodies started to pile up, which made the lung-bursting work all the more harder. The fighting continued for hours in the freezing conditions. Men on both sides were exhausted and the outcome was still in the balance. But as time wore on, the greater numbers of Lancastrian troops began to tell. The Yorkists, outnumbered and still feeling the effects of the quick march north, began to give ground on the left of their line and were slowly being forced to retreat up the slope at the southern end of the battlefield. For Edward, this was the key moment in his short reign so far. With more and more fresh men being thrown into the fray, the young king must have been anxiously looking southwards for any sign of reinforcements.
At that particular time when Norfolk was on the road, Edward's army was being pushed back to the southern edge of Towton battlefield, where there's quite a distinctive downslope. If it had reached that downslope, then it would have probably been the end for the Yorkists.
At last, Norfolk's men appeared on the battlefield, coming from the south, from the direction of Ferrybridge, and their presence swung the battle decisively in favour of the young Edward.
They arrived on the field on the right-hand side of Edward's line late on in the battle and caused a swing in the lines to occur, and this pushed the Lancastrians even further back towards the edges of the plateau and the rivers that would cause such a problem for them in the rout.
With the two lines already starting to pivot anti-clockwise, Norfolk's advance pushed the lines even further about, which left the Lancastrians with the River Cock to their backs. The river had offered protection to their right flank when Somerset initially drew up his lines, but now it was going to act as a trap. The Lancastrians could not absorb the shock of Norfolk's charge. Their lines buckled and then broke. The Lancastrian soldiers were now left with a stark choice: stand your ground and be hacked to death, or flee towards the watery barrier of the river and possible escape. The rout had begun. However savage the battle would have been, it probably would have paled in comparison to the rout. Most contemporary sources and battle experts agree that this is when the worst of the slaughter would have happened. The Lancastrians, they took off their armour, they threw down their weapons and they literally ran for their lives. Unfortunately for them, the Yorkists were not about to show their prisoners any mercy. I met up with author and Towton battlefield expert Helen Cox to find out how the bloody drama unfolded. So now we're off down sort of the area towards Bloody Meadow, yes? Yeah. Right. So what options do these guys have at this point in the battle?
Well, the Lancastrians are really starting to run out of options. They're being literally squeezed in this direction by the pressure of the new Yorkist advance. Right. And this is where the topography of the battlefield starts to play its wicked part. This plateau looks quite a benign landscape, but it does hide a very nasty surprise, which is not immediately obvious as you're walking across it.
Right.
And so, given that now we've got triumphant Yorkists who are filled with bloodlust, riding these guys down, we've got men throwing away their arms and weapons, running in this direction, tossing off their helmets and whatever they can, literally running for their lives. And what happens to them is really one of the great tragedies of Towton. Trying to escape, trying to run downhill, which is an obvious thing to do if you're wanting to get off the battlefield. But in running downhill, it really sealed their fate.
So Helen, this is Bloody Meadow, and the first thing that strikes me is the steepness of this slope. The Lancastrians coming down here, it spells utter carnage straight away. So I mean, what other options did they have?
Well, at this point in the battle, there were men fleeing in every direction. Certainly some of them were being driven down the slope here towards the River Cock, but this was happening all around the edge of Towton Plateau. So anyone in a position to do so would have fled north to York, to Tadcaster, and really wherever they could get away from the field of battle, right. Leaving the poor old common man to be driven off the edge of the world, really, with the Yorkists hotly pursuing them in every direction.
Helen, we've walked halfway down this slope, and I'm looking back, and it's immense. I can't believe how steep it is.
Yes, it is pretty daunting, and to think that on Palm Sunday this would have been covered with snow and ice like a ski slope. So once men and horses had started coming down here, really there was no way back. There would have been people going head over heels, skidding pell-mell down this slope towards the river that we can see winding by today, which on Palm Sunday we believe was in spate because there'd been so much precipitation. So it would have burst its bank and flowed out onto the floodplain that you can see there. So as people were literally falling down this slope, they'd have ended up to their ankles, up to their knees, up to their waists, and then plunging into the beck itself, icy cold water.
Freezing,
I wonder myself how many people died simply of shock and hypothermia from hitting that when they're exhausted with the heat of battle.
People say that the river was running red with blood and that there was bridges of bodies. What do you think about that?
Well, it is conceivable. When you think about it, guys trying desperately to get across the river and escape on the other side, people would have been going into that water, losing their footing, maybe getting shot by the Yorkists as they fled. This is the reason that Towton turned into such an utter massacre. The rout here worse than routs in other Wars of the Roses battles, simply because of the geography and the impact that it had on people's choices. This really was the end of the road for the Lancastrian army.
It was the treatment of the Lancastrian prisoners that provides one of the most shocking chapters in the whole Towton story. Some rather chilling clues to their fate came with the recent discovery of what are now called the Towton Graves.
So Alan, tell me the background to these mass graves, and what did they actually find when they got there then?
All they knew to start with that they'd got more than 2 or 3.
Wow.
And that they were all packed together. It was former colleagues who actually did the excavation, and they found in fact that there were some 43 individuals, and they were packed like sardines into a grave which was basically only about 6 foot long, 3 foot wide, and only about 4 foot deep.
So they were literally just killed and chucked in?
Yeah, it seems like it. Yeah.
So this was one that was brought back from Towton, from the mass grave, but what's so particular and fascinating about this one?
Well, what's interesting with this one is that there are some signs on this skeleton that he had made some attempt to save himself.
But how do we actually know that?
Well, if we look at this, what we call a blunt force injury, in other words, something big and solid hit him on his right arm, and we can tell from the position that essentially he was cowering like this, and so he was clubbed about here.
Somebody's just gone straight down.
That's right.
Wow.
But he's unusual.
Okay.
There's only one other that shows clear signs that they could actually defend themselves, and that immediately made us realise that this was a very unusual grave. And if we come round to the next individual, who was the oldest of the group, who was in his late 40s, more likely probably about 50. So this is one of the older individuals that we found, and you've only got to look at the build of his bones to realise that he was a big and powerful man. You can tell from just looking at his skeleton that he was in great shape.
Right.
But with lots of signs too that he'd been injured and knocked about in his past life. So we almost wonder if this one was basically a professional soldier.
Okay, a fighter.
Yeah, and there's a clear sign from his hips that he'd been regularly riding as well.
Okay, right. And 40s to 50s is a good year to live in this kind of era as well.
It was. He, like the others, had basically been killed because his head had been stoved in by multiple blows. And looking through the fragments of his bone, what is most interesting really is his lower jaw. If you look at this, you can see that there's clear signs of a blade cut running along here. But the interesting thing is that the bone around this is rounded. And what that tells us is this was a massive injury that he'd had, but perhaps 10 years before he actually died.
No, so he survived it?
He survived it, and this was a blow that could well kill even today.
Well, he's been, so basically his jaw's been literally cut in half, slashed through by a blade, but they've actually repaired him and he survived it.
That's right, that's the amazing thing. What makes Towton sad is that these men were essentially butchered.
Yeah.
That they were, we think, probably lined up by the side of the grave and systematically and very personally killed, then tipped into the grave. That was then covered over and nobody knew about it until the builders started putting in the footings for a garage.
Unbelievable.
The fact that these guys were killed in such a horrendous manner led me to the supposition that they were killed intentionally in the village for a reason and not on the battlefield. I think that these were men that meant something to the Lancastrians. They may have been captains, they may have been prominent members of the Lancastrian military machine. So my supposition is that these were executions and not simply killings in the village.
The remains that now lie in Bradford University are a testament to the horrific and bitter fighting that occurred at Towton all those years ago.
Helen, the Battle of Towton is commonly known as the bloodiest battle in British history, especially in the War of the Roses. We're in Bloody Meadow. How bloody was bloody?
Well, in terms of the casualty figures, people at the time were talking in the order of 20,000 killed. Other figures speak of 28,000, 35,000 killed, which is a staggering number. If those figures are anything like accurate, we could be talking about 50,000 plus men on the field at the start of the day.
Wow, that's like a crammed Wembley Stadium.
Yes, although other people believe that these figures are just enormous exaggerations, both the figures to begin with and the casualty figures. And it's always very difficult to know with battles of this period how accurate the numbers actually are. My hunch is that it was a far bigger than usual battle, but in terms of the real numbers, nobody's ever going to know.
The amount of casualties at Towton is another quite difficult subject. And I think the fact that the heralds counted 28,000 is one of those figures that you can't readily dismiss from a group of individuals whose job it was to go around a field afterwards and account for the amount of dead that were on the field. I think the things that were different about Towton were the fact that the rivers caused casualties, the battlefield caused casualties, the topography of the battlefield was quite unique. The one-sided archery duel, for instance, at the start of the battle, would have caused immense casualties in the Lancastrian ranks. So there's a number of salient points coming together here to make it a large medieval battle with large casualty figures. Certainly the largest casualty figures in the medieval era.
And after it was over, what of the wounded? exhausted and bleeding. What hope had they of avoiding joining their dead comrades?
We asked medieval medical expert Chris Felton to demonstrate some of the surgery carried out on the battlefields of the 15th century.
One of the most commonly caused injuries would be from the arrowheads. We've got the broad head here, and we've got the bodkin. How would you go about treating injuries sustained from these?
They cause very different wounds. The bodkin point, of course, is narrow and thin and designed to slip through the gaps in armour, even through the eye slits in a helmet. But that just means they're quite easy to take out. The real problems are caused by the broadheads.
Okay.
And these aren't designed to kill. They're designed to annoy horses. The point is, they thrust into flesh, grab hold, and as the horse runs, it jiggles around and moves. The problem is they don't just hit the horses, they hit the riders as well. Rich noblemen in very expensive armour who will go to the surgeon and demand that it's removed.
So how would you go about getting one of those out?
Well, I can show you, but first of all, I'll have to get it in.
Okay. That's gone in very, very deep. Shall I just pull it out?
That was what soldiers always did, despite no matter how much you told them not to.
So if I give it a yank. Right, okay, so now we have an arrowhead stuck in the wound.
Well, we have to get it out of there, obviously. That's going to fester.
Yep. Okay, so how do we do that?
We have the tools. We have these arrow spoons. And what we'll do is we slide them into the wound. We follow the wound track down, slide it in there.
Oh, so you've got two either side. Ah, and then you try and grip the arrowhead. But now how do you get the arrowhead out?
Well, now we have to use it. It's like a roll plug. You put it inside the arrowhead.
Yeah.
And open it up.
Ah, and it picks it up. Ah, can I have a go?
And you can have a go.
Brilliant. Oh yeah, there we go. Slowly now, keep still. You're moving. There we go. Look at that. These are quite a really good way of doing it.
It is a very good set of tools.
Yeah, and we haven't really made more of the wound. We've kept it quite small.
No, now we have to sterilise the wound.
Okay, so how do we do that?
Well, now we go on to cauterizing.
Ooh, they look very, very hot, Chris. What are you going to be doing with that?
The idea of the cauterizing iron is to both kill the germs that are in there, or as they thought of it, miasma, and to seal the top, just like on a barbecue where you see the red hot metal lines across the burgers.
Yeah. So you're going to cauterize the flesh?
I need my assistant to hold the
I was going to say, do you want
open.
me to help you?
Yes.
All right. Watch my fingers.
And this is making sure that all the flesh there is sealed up.
Oh, it smells nice. So this, under no anaesthetic, probably not much pain relief, and you have just literally cauterized the flesh.
Yes, if you can look down there, it's nicely cooked.
Yeah, it is, yeah. So we've sealed the wound.
That quick. It's flash fried.
Flash fried. It's unbelievable, absolutely unbelievable.
The Wars of the Roses rumbled on for 24 more years. Despite what happened at Towton, it was the House of Lancaster that eventually won the great power struggle when the Yorkist King Richard III was beaten and killed at Bosworth Field in 1485. And one of the great royal dynasties was born.
But these fields still hang heavy with the events that passed on that freezing cold Palm Sunday all those years ago. The Battle of Towton was one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on British soil. The dead may well have numbered some 13 to 28,000, and many were victims of the weapons we've seen in this programme.